Vue project file structure. Slide 1, Introduction. Welcome back. In our previous video, we successfully set up our Vue development environment and created our first Vite project. Now it's time to understand what we've created. A well-organized file structure is crucial for building maintainable Vue applications, especially when using the Composition API. Let's take a deep dive into every folder and file in our project and understand how they work together. Slide 2, Complete Project Overview. Here's the complete structure of our Vue project. At the top level, we have the public folder for static assets that are served as is, and the src folder containing all our application source code. Inside src, we have several important folders: assets for build time processed files, components for reusable UI elements, and composables. This is where the magic of the Composition API happens. We also have router for navigation configuration, stores for state management with Pinia, and views for our page-level components. The main.ts file is our application entry point, and app.vue is our root component. Finally, we have configuration files like package.json, vite.config.ts, and xconfig.json that control how our project behaves. Slide 3, Root Level Configuration. Let's start with the configuration files at the root level. The package.json file defines our dependencies and contains scripts for development, building, and previewing our application. When you run npm run dev, it executes the vite command defined here. The vite.config.ts file is where we configure our build tool. By default, it imports the Vue plugin that enables Vite to process Vue's single-file components. The xconfig.json configures TypeScript compilation with modern settings that work great with Vue 3 and the Composition API. And index.html is our entry HTML file that contains the div with Deeop where our Vue application will mount. Slide 4, Public vs Assets. Understanding the difference between public and assets folders is crucial. The public folder contains static files that are served exactly as they are, without any processing by Vite. Files here are accessed via root URL paths. For example, favicon.ico in public can be accessed as favicon.ico. Use this folder for files that don't need optimization, like robots.txt or large media files. The assets folder, on the other hand, contains files that are processed during build time. Vite will optimize these files, potentially renaming them with hashes for better caching. You import these files directly in your components, and Vite handles the rest. Use assets for images, CSS files, and fonts that your components need to import. Slide 5, Components Organization. The Components folder is where we organize our reusable UI elements. I recommend creating subfolders to keep things organized. The Base folder contains foundational UI components like base button and base input that you'll use throughout your app. The Layout folder holds structural components like the header, the sidebar, and the footer. Notice the prefix indicating these are singleton components. The UI folder contains more specific UI elements like user card or productee list. This organization makes it easy to find and maintain your components as your project grows. Remember to use Pascal case for component names. This is a Vue convention that helps distinguish components from regular HTML elements. Slide 6, Composables, Composition API Heart. Now we reach the heart of modern Vue development, the Composables folder. This is where the Composition API truly shines. Composables are functions that encapsulate reactive logic and can be reused across multiple components. For example, useCounter.ts might contain logic for managing a counter state with increment and decrement functions. Use auth.ts could handle user authentication, use fetch.ts might provide data fetching utilities, and use validation.ts could contain form validation logic. The beauty of composables is that they're just functions that return reactive state and methods, making them highly testable and reusable. This is where you'll spend a lot of time as you master the Composition API. Slide 7, Views vs Components. Understanding the difference between views and components is important for good architecture. Views are page-level components that correspond to different routes in your application. They handle route parameters, compose smaller components together, and contain the business logic for that particular page. Components, on the other hand, are focused on presentation and reusability. They accept props, emit events, and should be as pure as possible. A good rule of thumb, if it's connected to a route, it belongs in views. If it's a reusable piece of UI, it belongs in components. This separation makes your code more maintainable and your components more testable. Slide 8, Router Configuration. The router folder contains your Vue router configuration. The index.ts file defines all the routes in your application, mapping URL paths to Vue components. You'll notice it uses create router and create web history for modern browser routing. Routes can load components immediately or use dynamic imports for code splitting. This means the About Vue component will only be loaded when someone actually visits the About page, making your initial app bundle smaller. As your application grows, you might organize routes into separate files, but this single file approach works well for most projects. Slide 9, Stores with Pinia. The Stores folder contains your Pinia state management. What's exciting is that Pinia stores use the Composition API syntax by default. Each store is essentially a composable function that manages global state. In the counter store example, we use ref for reactive state, computed for derived values, and regular functions for actions. This feels very familiar if you're coming from the Composition API in components. The beauty is that you can use the same reactive primitives, ref, computed, watch, that you use in components, but now for global state management. Slide 10, Core Application Files. Let's look at the two most important files in your application. The main.ts file is where everything starts. It creates the Vue application instance, registers plugins like Pinia and Vue Router, and mounts the app to the DOM. This is where you'd add any global configurations or plugins. App.Vue is your root component that wraps your entire application. In most cases, it simply contains Router Vue, which renders the appropriate Vue component based on the current route. You might also add global navigation elements or layouts here. The script setup syntax you see here is the modern way to write Composition API components. It's more concise than the traditional Options API. Slide 11, Development Workflow. Here's how these folders work together in a typical development workflow. First, you identify reusable logic and create composables. These are the building blocks of your reactive functionality. Next, you build components that use these composables to create UI elements. Then you create views that compose these components into complete pages. You configure routes to connect URLs to your views, and create Pinia stores when you need to share state across multiple components. Finally, you add any static assets or build time assets as needed. This workflow leverages the Composition API's strength in code reuse and organization. Slide 12, Best Practices and Next Steps. Let's wrap up with some best practices for organizing your Vue project. Always use descriptive and consistent naming conventions. This makes your code self-documenting. Group related functionality together, and keep your composables focused on single responsibilities. Most importantly, separate presentation logic in components from business logic in composables. This makes your code more testable and reusable. Use TypeScript throughout your project. It provides excellent developer experience, especially with the Composition API where types can be inferred automatically. Avoid putting all components in one flat folder structure, and resist the urge to mix business logic directly into your presentation components. The composables pattern encourages better separation of concerns.